The old Victorian house stood at the end of a forgotten road, surrounded by towering pine trees deep in the American countryside. Even during the day, the place looked dark, as if sunlight itself refused to touch it. The locals called it Black Hollow House, and every family in town had a different terrifying story about it. Some claimed they heard screams coming from inside on stormy nights. Others swore they had seen a woman dressed in white standing silently at the upstairs window before disappearing into thin air. Aisha, a 26-year-old Pakistani woman, had recently married her husband, Hamza, and moved from Lahore to the United States to begin a new life. Hamza had found the old house at an unbelievably cheap price. Every real estate agent refused to explain why it had remained empty for nearly 20 years. They simply smiled nervously and said, "If you want it, it's yours." The first day felt normal. They unpacked boxes, cleaned dusty rooms, and tried to ignore the strange silence that surrounded the property. There were no birds singing, no dogs barking. Even the wind seemed to stop at the edge of the forest. That evening, while arranging old books in the attic, Aisha discovered a faded family photograph. Everyone in the picture looked normal except for one young woman. Her face had been completely scratched out with something sharp. Written on the back of the photograph were only 6 chilling words. She never truly left this house. A cold shiver ran through Aisha's body. She quickly placed the picture back into the box and convinced herself it was just an old family prank. Night arrived faster than expected. Heavy rain began crashing against the windows while thunder shook the entire house. Around 3:03 a.m., Aisha suddenly opened her eyes. She had no idea what had awakened her. Then she heard it. Slow footsteps. Someone was walking down the hallway outside the bedroom. Step, step, step. She quietly reached over to wake Hamza. He was sleeping peacefully. The footsteps stopped directly outside their bedroom door. Silence filled the room. Then, knock. A long pause. Knock. Another pause. Knock. A freezing whisper came from the other side of the door, in perfect Urdu. Aisha Darwaza Mat Kolna. Her heart almost stopped. No one in America knew her name, and no one except her husband knew she spoke Urdu. The bedroom lights flickered violently. When she slowly turned her head toward the mirror hanging beside the closet, she saw a pale woman standing only a few feet behind her. The woman's eyes were completely black. She smiled. Then she slowly raised one finger to her lips. Shoo! Aisha's scream echoed through the attic as the heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Hamza rushed toward the door and pulled the rusted handle with all his strength, but it refused to move. It felt as though someone on the other side was holding it closed. The flashlight began flickering. The air inside the attic grew colder with every passing second. Dust floated through the darkness, and a strange smell filled the room, a mixture of rotten wood and something that reminded Aisha of an old hospital. The rocking chair that had stopped only moments earlier began moving again. Back, forward, back, forward. Each movement became slower, almost as if someone invisible was sitting in it. Hamza forced himself to walk closer. Aisha, stay behind me, he whispered. As the flashlight beam reached the chair, they noticed something lying underneath it. It was an old leather diary covered in thick dust. Hamza picked it up with shaking hands. The cover read, "Property of Sarah Williams, 1986. Aisha slowly opened the diary. The first few pages contained normal family memories. But the writing suddenly changed. The words became messy, almost impossible to read. One sentence was repeated again and again across several pages. She watches from the mirror. She watches from the mirror. She watches from the mirror. Aisha's breathing became heavy. She slowly looked toward an old cracked mirror leaning against the attic wall. For a brief second, she saw herself. Then another face appeared beside hers. The same pale woman. The same empty black eyes. The same horrifying smile. Aisha screamed and dropped the diary. The mirror instantly shattered without anyone touching it. Glass exploded across the floor. At that exact moment, every window in the house burst open downstairs. A freezing wind rushed through the attic. The whisper returned, louder than before. Leave, before sunrise, or you will never leave at all. Suddenly, the attic door unlocked on its own. Hamza grabbed Aisha's hand, and both of them ran downstairs as fast as they could. When they reached the living room, they froze. The front door was wide open. Rain poured inside the house. On the wooden floor, written in fresh red letters, was a message neither of them had seen before. The third night is when she chooses. Before either of them could speak, someone quietly closed the front door from outside. But when Hamza rushed to the window, there was no one standing in the rain. The rain continued to pour as thunder rolled across the dark American sky. Hamza locked every door and every window in the house, but neither he nor Aisha could erase the horrifying message they had seen written on the wooden floor. The third night is when she chooses. Hamza grabbed a bucket of water and tried to wash the words away. To his surprise, the red letters slowly disappeared beneath the cloth. Relieved, he stood up. But only a few seconds later, the same message began appearing again, this time on the living room wall. Neither of them touched the wall. Neither of them spoke. The words simply wrote themselves, one letter at a time. Aisha stepped backward, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Suddenly, the television switched on by itself. The screen showed nothing but black and white static. Then, without warning, the image changed. It was a live view of their own house. The camera seemed to be standing outside in the rain. Hamza frowned. "There are no security cameras outside," he whispered. The picture slowly zoomed toward the front door. Then it moved through the wall as if nothing were there. The invisible camera entered the living room. It showed Hamza. It showed Aisha. Then the image revealed something standing directly behind them. A tall woman dressed in an old white gown. Her long black hair covered her face. She stood completely still. Aisha immediately turned around. There was nobody there. When she looked back at the television, the woman was gone. Instead, the screen displayed a date. October 14th, 1986. A loud ringing sound echoed through the house. An old telephone sitting on a dusty table suddenly began ringing. Neither of them had noticed the phone before. Hamza slowly picked up the receiver. For several seconds, silence. Then an elderly woman's trembling voice whispered, "If you want to survive, go to the church before the third sunrise. The house feeds on fear. It has already learned her name." The line went dead. At that exact moment, the electricity failed once again. The entire house fell into darkness. Only the flashlight remained. As Hamza shined it across the hallway, he noticed every family photograph hanging on the wall had changed. The faces were no longer strangers. Every photograph now showed Hamza and Aisha, but they were dressed in clothes from the 1980s. In every picture, they looked terrified, and standing behind them in each photograph was the same pale woman with empty black eyes. Aisha began crying. "This can't be real," she whispered. Then a loud crash came from upstairs. It sounded like heavy furniture being dragged across the floor. The noise continued for nearly a minute. When it finally stopped, complete silence filled the house. Hamza gathered every ounce of courage he had left and slowly climbed the staircase. As he reached the second floor, he saw that the attic door was wide open again. Inside, a small wooden music box was playing a slow, haunting lullaby. It had never been there before. As the music ended, a little girl's voice echoed through the attic. "She's waiting for you in the basement." Before either of them could react, the basement door downstairs slowly creaked open by itself. Hamza and Aisha stood frozen as the basement door slowly opened on its own. A freezing wind rushed through the hallway, carrying a strange whisper that neither of them could understand. Hamza tightened his grip on the flashlight and looked at Aisha. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. Every step toward the basement felt heavier than the last. The wooden stairs groaned beneath their feet as they descended into complete darkness. The air smelled damp, and the walls were covered with old water stains. At the bottom of the stairs, they found dozens of dusty boxes scattered across the floor. In the center of the basement stood a single wooden chair facing the wall. Someone, or something, had been sitting there recently because the chair was still gently rocking. Hamza slowly turned the chair around. Resting on it was a faded photograph of a young woman holding a baby. On the back of the picture were the words, "She only takes those who answer her." Suddenly, a baby's cry echoed through the basement. Aisha covered her mouth in horror. The crying grew louder until it sounded as if the baby was standing only a few feet away. Hamza shined the flashlight across the room, but there was nothing there. Then the beam stopped on an old iron door hidden behind broken shelves. Strange symbols had been carved into the metal, and several heavy chains were wrapped around it. Before Hamza could move closer, the chains began shaking violently on their own. A deep growl echoed from behind the door. The entire basement trembled as if something massive had slammed against the other side. Aisha screamed and grabbed Hamza's arm. Without warning, one of the chains snapped and fell onto the floor with a deafening crash. A terrifying whisper filled the basement. "You opened the house. Now the house has opened you." At that exact moment, the flashlight went out. In the darkness, two glowing black eyes slowly appeared only inches away from Aisha's face. Two glowing black eyes stared directly into Aisha's face. She screamed and stumbled backward, pulling Hamza with her. The flashlight suddenly flickered back to life, but the eyes had disappeared. The basement was silent again. Hamza quickly picked up the flashlight and pointed it toward the iron door. Another chain had fallen to the ground. Something was trying to break free from the other side. A low scratching sound echoed through the room as if long fingernails were dragging across metal. Hamza grabbed Aisha's hand and rushed toward the stairs. Just as they reached the top, the basement door slammed shut behind them with such force that the entire house shook. They locked the door, knowing it would not truly stop whatever lived below. As dawn approached, both of them searched every room for anything that could explain the nightmare. Inside an old bedroom closet, Aisha discovered a small wooden box hidden beneath loose floorboards. Inside were dozens of letters tied together with a black ribbon. The first letter was written by a woman named Sarah. She explained that the house did not simply haunt people. It chose one person from every family to remain there forever. Every family that ignored the warnings vanished without a trace. The final page contained a hand-drawn map leading to an abandoned church deep inside the forest. At the bottom of the page, Sarah had written one final message. "If you reach the church before the third night ends, you still have a chance. If you arrive too late, she will follow you forever." As Hamza folded the map, they heard 3 slow knocks on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. They looked through the window, but no one was outside. When Hamza unlocked the door, a cold wind swept into the house. Lying on the doorstep was an old suitcase covered in mud. It had a faded luggage tag with only 2 words written on it: Aisha Khan. Aisha's face turned pale. She had never owned that suitcase. With trembling hands, she slowly opened it. Inside was a bundle of old clothes, a cracked mirror, and a death certificate bearing her own name. The date of death was tomorrow. The death certificate slipped from Aisha's trembling hands as she stared at tomorrow's date. Hamza picked it up again, hoping it was some cruel prank, but every detail was correct, even her full name and date of birth. Before either of them could speak, the cracked mirror inside the suitcase began to shake. A thin crack spread across the glass until a pale face slowly appeared in the reflection. It was the same woman with empty black eyes. This time she smiled and whispered, "There is no escape." The mirror suddenly exploded into hundreds of tiny pieces, sending sharp glass across the floor. At that exact moment, every clock in the house stopped at 3:03. A loud church bell echoed through the forest even though the abandoned church was supposed to be miles away. Hamza grabbed the map they had found and decided they could not wait any longer. They packed only a flashlight, the diary, and the map before running outside. Rain soaked the narrow path leading into the forest. The deeper they walked, the quieter everything became. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Even the wind had disappeared. After nearly an hour, they noticed strange wooden crosses planted between the trees. Each cross carried the name of a family that had once lived in Black Hollow House. Some looked decades old, while others appeared almost new. Then Aisha stopped walking. One final cross stood ahead of them. It had no date engraved on it, only 2 freshly carved names, Aisha and Hamza. Fear gripped them as the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. A thick black mist rolled between the trees, and slow footsteps echoed from every direction. Hamza shined the flashlight into the darkness, but the beam revealed only moving shadows. Then, through the mist, the pale woman appeared once again. She was no longer walking. She was floating silently toward them. As she came closer, dozens of ghostly figures emerged behind her, each wearing frightened expressions as though trapped forever. The woman slowly raised one hand and pointed toward the abandoned church visible at the top of the hill. Then she whispered in a voice that echoed through the forest, "Only one of you will leave before sunrise." Aisha and Hamza stood frozen as the pale woman vanished into the black mist. The ghostly figures behind her slowly disappeared among the trees, leaving only silence. Neither of them spoke. They knew every second mattered before sunrise. Holding the map tightly, Hamza led the way toward the abandoned church on the hill. The old building looked ready to collapse. Its broken stained glass windows reflected the moonlight, and the large wooden doors hung open as if someone had been waiting for them. As they stepped inside, the heavy doors slammed shut behind them. Dust filled the air, and rows of broken benches stretched toward the altar. On the stone floor, dozens of candles suddenly lit themselves one by one, forming a narrow path. At the end of the path stood an old priest dressed in black robes. His face looked pale, and his eyes were filled with sadness. He quietly said, "You are too late. She has already marked one of you." Hamza showed him Sarah's diary, hoping for answers. The priest opened the final hidden page. It revealed the truth that had been missing all along. Decades earlier, Sarah had tried to perform a forbidden ritual inside Black Hollow House to bring her dead daughter back to life. The ritual failed and released an evil spirit that trapped every family who entered the house. The spirit grew stronger with every victim and could never leave unless someone willingly took its place. Before Hamza could ask another question, the church bells rang violently. The candles went out together, and the entire church shook. Dark shadows began crawling across the walls and ceiling. A deep whisper echoed from every direction. "Choose, or I will choose for you." Suddenly, Aisha disappeared. Hamza turned in panic, calling her name again and again, but only his own voice echoed back. Then he heard her scream from beneath the church. He found a hidden staircase leading underground. As he rushed down, he entered a massive stone chamber where hundreds of old mirrors covered the walls. Every mirror reflected Aisha standing alone, crying for help. But only one reflection was real. Behind each of the others stood the pale woman, smiling silently. Hamza had only moments to decide which reflection to trust before the spirit reached her. Hamza's heart pounded as he stared at the countless mirrors. Every reflection showed Aisha calling his name, but only one could be real. He closed his eyes for a moment and remembered the priest's warning. The spirit can copy faces, but it cannot copy faith. Hamza whispered a prayer under his breath and slowly opened his eyes again. This time he noticed something different. In every false reflection, Aisha cast no shadow. Only one mirror showed her shadow clearly on the stone floor. Without hesitating, Hamza ran toward that mirror and struck it with all his strength. The glass shattered with a deafening crash. Aisha fell out onto the ground, frightened but alive. At the same instant, every other mirror cracked, and the pale woman let out a terrifying scream that echoed through the underground chamber. The walls began to collapse. Stones rained from the ceiling as the entire church shook violently. Hamza grabbed Aisha's hand, and they ran toward the staircase, but the pale woman suddenly appeared in front of them. Her face twisted into a horrifying smile as she whispered, "You can leave, but one soul must stay." Dark hands rose from the floor and wrapped around Hamza's legs, pulling him downward. Aisha desperately tried to free him, but the shadows only tightened their grip. Then she remembered Sarah's diary. She pulled the diary from her bag and read the final hidden words aloud. A blinding light filled the chamber, and the shadows screamed as they retreated. The pale woman stepped back for the first time, her expression changing from anger to fear. The ground split apart beneath her feet, and a powerful wind swept through the chamber. Hamza broke free from the shadows, and together they raced up the staircase. As they burst out of the church, the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon. Behind them, the abandoned church shook one final time before a thunderous roar echoed across the forest. When they turned around, the pale woman was standing silently at the church entrance, watching them with her empty black eyes. She slowly smiled and whispered one final sentence that chilled them both. "This story is not over, because the house remembers your names." The first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds as Hamza and Aisha ran out of the forest without looking back. For the first time in days, the air felt warm, and the terrifying whispers had disappeared. Both of them believed the nightmare had finally ended. They drove away from Black Hollow House and checked into a small roadside motel nearly 200 miles away. Exhausted, they locked the door, closed the curtains, and tried to sleep. Everything seemed peaceful until midnight. Suddenly, the television switched on by itself. The screen remained black for several seconds before a single sentence slowly appeared in white letters. Distance cannot save you. The lights began flickering, and a freezing wind filled the room even though every window was closed. Hamza rushed to unplug the television, but the screen stayed on. Then it showed a live image of Black Hollow House. The front door slowly opened, and the camera moved inside. Every room was empty until it reached the attic. There, standing beside the old rocking chair, was the pale woman. She slowly lifted her head and looked directly into the camera. Then she smiled. At that exact moment, someone knocked 3 times on the motel room door. Knock, knock, knock. Hamza looked through the peephole. The hallway was completely empty. As he stepped back, another knock echoed, this time from inside the bathroom. Aisha slowly pushed the bathroom door open. The room was empty, but the mirror was covered with fresh words written from the inside. I followed you. Before they could react, the bathroom light burst, plunging the room into darkness. A shadow rushed past them and disappeared into the bedroom. Hamza turned on his flashlight. At the foot of the bed stood the same old muddy suitcase they had left behind at Black Hollow House. It slowly opened by itself. Inside was a new death certificate. This time the name was not Aisha's. It was Hamza's, and the date of death was only a few hours away. A cold laugh echoed through the motel room. When they looked toward the window, the pale woman was standing outside on the third-floor ledge, smiling with her empty black eyes. Then, without making a sound, she pointed toward the door as someone on the other side slowly began turning the handle. The motel room door slowly creaked open on its own. Hamza stood in front of Aisha, gripping the flashlight with shaking hands. The hallway outside was completely empty, yet cold footprints began appearing on the carpet one after another, moving toward them. The room temperature dropped so suddenly that their breath became visible. Then the flashlight died. Darkness swallowed everything. A deep whisper echoed from every corner of the room. Your time has come. The pale woman stepped inside without making a sound. Her black eyes stared directly at Hamza. She slowly raised her hand, and dark shadows rushed across the walls like living creatures. Hamza remembered the old priest's final words. Evil survives only while fear controls your heart. Gathering every ounce of courage, he took the wooden cross the priest had given him from his pocket. Aisha held Sarah's diary tightly, and together they spoke the final prayer written on its last page. The entire room shook violently. The windows shattered, and a brilliant light surrounded them. The pale woman screamed louder than ever before. For the first time, her terrifying face changed. Tears rolled down her cheeks as the darkness around her began to disappear. The evil spirit that had controlled her for decades finally released its grip. The ghostly figures of the trapped families appeared behind her, no longer filled with fear, but with peace. One by one, they faded into the light. The woman looked at Aisha and whispered softly, "Thank you," before vanishing forever. At that same moment, far away in the forest, Black Hollow House cracked from its foundation and collapsed into the earth, ending its curse forever. Days later, Hamza and Aisha returned to their normal lives, believing everything was finally over. But on their anniversary, a small package arrived at their new home with no sender's name. Inside was the old family photograph from the attic. This time, every scratched face had returned, except one. A new, empty space had appeared at the end of the picture, waiting for another family. As Aisha turned the photograph over, she found a single sentence written in fresh black ink. Every ending is the beginning of another story.